My mother, Eleanor, was not just a woman, she was a covenant, a binding agreement of love, sacrifice, and, I believed, fairness. We were a quiet family in a wealthy corner of Florida. My mother, my younger brother, David, and me, Daniel. For 40 years, our lives revolved around her gentle, absolute authority. And for 40 years, I fulfilled my part of the unspoken contract. The contract was simple. David would be the chaos, and I would be the consequence. David would be the spectacular failure, and I would be the quiet, dependable success. David was a tempest, dropping out of school, losing jobs, accumulating debts, burning bridges, and I was the stable shore he always drifted back to. And who bailed him out? My mother. And who managed the bailouts, the legal fees, the furious phone calls from creditors? Me, Daniel, the eldest, the responsible one. I built a stable life, a good career as a financial analyst. I moved back to Florida to be close to them, not because I needed the sun, but because my mother needed me to manage the perpetual crisis that was David. I handled her finances, ensured her medical appointments were met, and spent every major holiday, not relaxing, but mediating the latest disaster David had engineered. My mother always gave me the same look, a look of profound gratitude mixed with a deep, private sadness, a look that said, "Thank you for being the one I don't have to worry about." I never asked for anything in return. I didn't need it. I assumed, with the arrogant confidence of the dutiful son, that my loyalty was my legacy. The entire family, the lawyers, the neighbors, they all knew. Daniel was the heir, not because of greed, but because of 20 years of earned responsibility. When my mother finally succumbed to her long illness, a quiet passing in her own bed, surrounded by the silence she always craved, the grief was immense. It was a grief complicated by relief. The exhaustion of a vigil finally ended. David arrived 3 days later, hungover and smelling faintly of cheap whiskey, too late for the final moments but just in time for the reading of the will. I handled the funeral. I managed the obituary. I selected the hymns. David argued about the color of the casket. I paid for it all. 2 weeks after the burial, we gathered in the sterile office of Mr. Henderson, my mother's longtime estate attorney. David slouched in his leather chair, tapping an impatient rhythm on the armrest. I sat upright, composed, holding a tissue I hadn't yet needed. I wasn't there for the money, but for the closure. I was ready to assume responsibility for the house, the small portfolio, and the memory. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and began reading. The preliminary bequests were standard. A few specific pieces of jewelry to my sister, Eleanor's gold watch to me. Then came the primary assets, the house, the significant investment portfolio, and the liquid assets totaling close to $4 million. Mr. Henderson paused, his eyes lifting over the reading glasses, resting briefly on me, then settling uncomfortably on the document. Eleanor's will, he stated formally, dated 12 months ago, directs that all remaining real estate and financial assets, in their entirety, are to be placed in an irrevocable trust established for the sole benefit of her son, David Markson. The silence that followed wasn't just silence. It was a vacuum. I felt the air leave the room. I stared at Mr. Henderson, waiting for the punchline, the legal joke. He never made eye contact. David, beside me, stopped tapping and slowly lifted his head, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "Excuse me," I finally managed, my voice a dry rasp. "There must be a mistake. A typo. All assets to David? What about the residual estate? What about the management of the portfolio? Mr. Henderson adjusted his tie. Mr. Markson, the will is explicit. There is no residual estate. The entire fortune is directed to the David Markson Trust, of which David is the sole, immediate beneficiary. You, Daniel, are listed only as the contingent executor, to be appointed only in the event of David's death. I felt a cold, hard sickness bloom in my stomach. The contract was broken, not by me, but by my mother. 20 years of sacrifice, management, and loyalty erased in one brutal sentence. My mother had rewarded the chaos and disinherited the consequence. David let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Looks like Mom knew who deserved a break, Danny boy. Guess the responsible ones can always take care of themselves, right? I stood up, not looking at David, but at Mr. Henderson. I need a copy of that will, the full document, immediately. My voice was quiet, but it was not a request. It was an order. I walked out of that office and into the harsh daylight, carrying a new, terrifying certainty. My mother hadn't just made a mistake. She had left behind a monumental, devastating lie, and I had to expose it. I didn't confront David immediately. Confrontation was his terrain, loud, messy, and designed to distract. I was a financial analyst. My terrain was silence, data, and irrefutable evidence. I left Henderson's office with the full document clutched in my hand, the crisp paper feeling like cheap sandpaper against my palm. The will itself was legally sound, flawlessly drafted, but the core decision to disinherit the responsible son in favor of the perpetually failing one was a violation of my mother's deepest held values. Eleanor was obsessively fair. She measured responsibility in ounces and demanded that debts, both financial and moral, be paid. This Vasiat name was illogical. It was an anomaly. I began my investigation with the trust itself, the David Markson Trust. I pulled the legal documents and studied the fine print. David wasn't just receiving the money. The trust was structured to give him immediate total control over the principal, meaning he could liquidate the entire $4 million in cash and blow it on reckless ventures within weeks. This wasn't protection. It was a blank check for disaster. My mother, who obsessed over the expiration dates on her milk, would never have left her legacy so vulnerable. I examined the signature on the will. It was her signature, Eleanor's distinctive, elegant script. But as a man who had reviewed thousands of legal documents, I noticed a subtle hesitation in the E, a slight tremor that wasn't normally there. It was close, almost perfect. But was it the tremor of old age, or was it the tremor of forgery? My attention inevitably shifted to David. He had moved into my mother's house the day after the will reading, treating it like a college dorm. The man who had refused to manage his own life for 40 years now had the responsibility of $4 million. The chaos was immediate. He bought a ludicrously expensive convertible, began throwing loud, obnoxious parties, and installed a home theater system that could be heard 3 houses away. He was spending the capital, not investing it. He was validating my mother's worst fear and my greatest suspicion. David never worked a day in his life without being fired. He couldn't balance a checkbook or hold a conversation without borrowing money. Yet he had successfully engineered a complex, legally flawless trust document that bypassed all logical family planning. The pieces refused to fit. I reached out to my sister, Clara, who lived across the country. I didn't tell her the specifics of the disinheritance, only that David had been granted control of the primary assets. Clara, usually calm, was livid. "Are you serious, Daniel? He's going to bankrupt her memory. Mom knew he was irresponsible. She put you in charge of her utilities, not David." "Did Mom ever mention changing her will last year?" I asked, my voice flat. Clara paused. She mentioned signing some final papers with Mr. Henderson, but she said it was just adding language about medical directives. She was stressed, Dan. She hated talking about death. She absolutely hated it. I focused my gaze on the timing. The will was signed 12 months prior, exactly when my mother's illness took a rapid, debilitating turn. Her cognitive function had begun to waver. She was easily confused, easily manipulated. And David, the perpetual predator, was the only one constantly orbiting her. I began tracking David's movements during that 12-month period. I accessed my mother's old calendar and cross-referenced David's known location, usually a cheap, rented room in the city. I found an unsettling pattern. David had initiated several long, unannounced visits to the house during the exact weeks my mother was weakest. He would cancel his own plans, disappear from his known haunts, and reappear days later, smelling of my mother's expensive air freshener and wearing an unearned smugness. He hadn't forged the will. That would have been too crude for David's limited intelligence. He had engineered it. He had subtly, persistently, and cruelly manipulated a dying woman into signing away her future. But how? How did he manage the legal structure? My investigation led me back to Mr. Henderson, the estate attorney. I scheduled a private meeting with him, not as a client, but as a concerned party. Henderson was old school, cautious, and deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Markson, your mother was entirely competent when she signed the document," he insisted, wiping his brow nervously. "I witnessed the signing. We followed protocol." "I don't dispute her signature, Mr. Henderson," I countered, leaning forward, my voice low and dangerous. "I dispute the intent. My mother had no financial acumen. She didn't know the difference between an irrevocable trust and a revocable one. Who explained the terms to her? Who requested that the sole beneficiary be given immediate, unfettered access to the principal?" Henderson stammered, pulling out his file notes. "Your brother, David, was present at the review session. He was assisting your mother with the logistics. He stressed that she wanted to give David a clear path to self-sufficiency without my interference. I had it. Assisting. David hadn't forged the document. He had ghost-written his own inheritance. He had leveraged my mother's fading health, her desire to see her failing son finally fixed, and Henderson's desire for a quick, uncomplicated signing. David hadn't stolen the money. He had stolen his mother's consent. But a theft of consent, while morally repugnant, is legally difficult to prove. I couldn't just challenge the will. I had to find an external, definitive flaw that would render the entire document invalid. And I knew exactly where to look next. David's own chaotic criminal past. Because the man who steals a fortune rarely stops there. The theft of consent was morally repugnant, but legally challenging the will on those grounds, arguing undue influence, was a long, messy, and expensive affair. It would drag my mother's final year through the mud, and there was no guarantee of success. I needed an angle of attack that was definitive, technical, and irrefutable. I needed a flaw in the document that had nothing to do with my mother's intentions, but everything to do with David's perpetual incompetence. And the quickest way to find a flaw in David's plan was to look at David himself. I knew my brother. David was a disaster magnet. He had accumulated more unpaid parking tickets, outstanding utility bills, and bounce checks than a small city. While I was managing my mother's stable portfolio, I was also, secretly, managing David's peripheral chaos, quietly settling his debts to keep him from destroying the family name. But I hadn't managed everything. I focused my search on the period immediately preceding the will's signing, the critical 12 months when David was assisting my mother. My hypothesis: David must have done something illegal or financially destructive during that time, something that would have rendered him legally ineligible to inherit under specific common state laws. I spent the next week operating entirely in the shadows. I hired a private investigator, not to spy on David's parties, but to pull every piece of public legal record associated with his name in 3 different states. I tracked old rental agreements, utility shut-off notices, and most importantly, civil court filings. The trove of documents was overwhelming, a testament to a life lived without structure. Most of it was useless noise, small claims, bounced checks. Then I found it. Tucked into a 20-page document regarding a small defaulted business loan from 3 years ago was the fatal flaw. 3 years ago, David had tried to start an ill-fated consulting firm. He defaulted on the loan, the bank sued, and David predictably ignored the summons. The bank was awarded a default judgment, but the document contained a lesser-known specific clause demanded by the bank. In addition to the debt, the court issued a rare, narrow ruling that for 5 years following the judgment, David Markson would be legally restricted from holding positions of fiduciary trust. Specifically, the legal to manage or execute a trust involving significant capital. The court had essentially deemed him a financial liability to the state itself. I stared at the document on my screen, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across my face. David hadn't just ignored a bank. He had incurred a specific legal restriction that invalidated the entire structure of his inheritance. The David Markson Trust, which was designed to grant David immediate, unfettered access to the principal, was legally a position of fiduciary trust. By definition, David was legally prohibited from executing or managing such a trust until the 5-year restriction period elapsed. The will was signed a year after this judgment was filed, meaning that at the time of the signing, David was legally ineligible to receive the money in that specific format. My mother's Vassiette name wasn't flawed due to manipulation. It was flawed due to David's prior criminal negligence and the subsequent forgotten court order. David hadn't anticipated that the chaos of his past would contaminate the structure of his future. I immediately scheduled a meeting with Clara, my mother's attorney. I didn't tell her what I had found. I simply placed the court document on her desk. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice quiet and steady, "when you drafted and witnessed the David Markson Trust, were you aware that the beneficiary was under a pre-existing court-ordered restriction that prohibited him from holding any position of fiduciary trust involving significant capital?" Henderson's face went white. He grabbed the document, his hands trembling violently. He hadn't checked. He had taken David's word and my mother's weary consent and failed to conduct the basic due diligence required when creating a multi-million-dollar trust. He had rushed the dying woman's paperwork and missed the biggest legal landmine. I was unaware of this civil judgment," he stammered. Mr. Markson, this renders the entire structure of the trust, as written, invalid. We cannot legally appoint David Markson as the immediate sole fiduciary beneficiary. My mother's will, the legal shield David had so cruelly engineered, was dead on arrival. It wasn't my mother's fault or my challenge. It was David's own failure that had finally, definitively ruined his grand plan. The consequence was immediate and technical. The will did not fail in its entirety, but the trust structure failed. Since the will did not contain language specifying a contingent, alternative beneficiary like me for the primary assets in the event of the trust's invalidation, the entire $4 million portfolio reverted to the estate's residual fund. And the executor of the residual fund was, by original definition, me, Daniel, the responsible son. I had found the flaw. I had rewritten the will without touching the ink. Now it was time to confront the thief. I didn't call David. I didn't send a formal letter. I walked into my mother's house, now legally my house pending the transfer of the residual estate, on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after discovering the fatal flaw in the trust document. The scene inside was exactly what I expected: chaos. Empty liquor bottles littered the antique dining table. The expensive home theater system David had installed was blaring some unrecognizable rap music. David himself was lounging on the sofa, a cheap beer in his hand, a look of smug, unearned entitlement plastered on his face. He was surrounded by 2 equally disreputable friends. He was already celebrating his inheritance with the money he had prematurely withdrawn. He saw me and laughed, a loud, grating sound. Well, if it isn't the responsible son. Come to pay your respects, Danny boy. Too bad, the party's just getting started. There's no more bail money here for you to manage, big brother. I dismissed his friends with a simple gesture. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked past them and stated, I need to talk to my brother. Privately. Leave now. My voice carried the calm, lethal authority of someone who holds all the cards. His friends, sensing the shift in dynamics, mumbled excuses and quickly retreated, leaving the music blaring in the sudden, sharp silence. I walked over and used the remote to mute the television. The silence returned, thick and anticipatory. What's the drama, Dan? Spill it. Don't tell me you're still mad about the will. You always said you didn't care about the money. David tried to retain his arrogant posture, but the certainty in my eyes was beginning to erode his confidence. I didn't argue the moral point. I went straight for the technical kill. I found your civil judgment from 3 years ago, David, I said, my voice low and devoid of emotion. The one from the failed consulting firm, the one where you defaulted on the loan. David frowned. What are you talking about? That's old news. That's a few $1,000s. I'll pay it back eventually. I pulled a clean, crisp copy of the court order from my briefcase and placed it on the coffee table. I pointed to the obscure, small paragraph near the bottom. It's not the money, David. It's the language. The judge ruled that for 5 years, you are restricted from holding any position of fiduciary trust involving significant capital. It's a penalty for negligence. David read the clause, his eyes darting frantically over the legal jargon. He still didn't understand. So what? It means I can't be a financial advisor. I'm the beneficiary, not the advisor, he yelled, his voice rising in panic. You were the intended sole beneficiary of the David Markson Irrevocable Trust. I explained, each word a slow, deliberate hammer blow. That structure, David, requires the beneficiary to hold an immediate position of fiduciary trust over the principal assets, a position the court explicitly stated you are legally ineligible to hold until your restriction expires in 2 more years. I paused, letting the information sink in. David's face was turning a sickly gray. You see, David, you didn't steal the inheritance. You were too incompetent to even steal correctly. Your prior criminal negligence created a legal impossibility. He lunged for the paper, tearing it in half. You're lying! Henderson wouldn't let this happen. He signed it. Henderson rushed the paperwork, I confirmed, and he missed the civil filing. But the law doesn't miss it. Clara and I have already filed the motion. The court has deemed the David Markson Trust invalid due to the beneficiary's legal ineligibility. I stood up, walking toward the grand staircase. Since the trust failed, and since Mother's will did not name a contingent beneficiary for the primary assets, the entire portfolio, the $4 million, and the house, reverts to the residual estate. I turned back to face him, delivering the final crushing sentence. And I, Daniel, as the sole named executor of the residual estate, now control all of it. You are legally homeless and penniless, and I am here to tell you to pack your belongings. You have 24 hours to vacate my property. David didn't move. He simply stared, his mouth hanging open in silent, complete devastation. The image of the arrogant, entitled son evaporated, replaced by the broken, small man he had always been. His entire future, his 2 decades of waiting for the grand payoff, was erased by a forgotten parking ticket and a neglected civil court filing. He tried one final desperate plea. Daniel, please. I'm your brother. I'll pay you back. I'll get clean. I'll share it. You had 40 years to get clean, David, I replied, my voice steady. And you chose to manipulate our dying mother. You chose to steal her dignity. I'm not doing this because of the money. I'm doing this for Mother's justice. She didn't disinherit me because she trusted you. She disinherited me because you forced her hand. I merely fulfilled the contract you chose to break. I left the house, leaving him alone in the wreckage of his shattered delusion. The music was still muted, the silence deafening. I drove away, not with joy, but with the cold, necessary satisfaction of a duty finally completed. The fallout from the confrontation was swift and final. David attempted to challenge the ruling, hiring a low-cost, aggressive lawyer who promised a quick victory. But my attorney, Henderson, now fighting desperately to save his own reputation from his negligence, was relentless. The court order proving David's fiduciary ineligibility was irrefutable. The judge, seeing the clear pattern of manipulation of an elderly parent combined with David's pre-existing financial chaos, sided with the executor, me. David was given exactly 24 hours to vacate the property, as I had ordered. He left in the early morning, not with defiance, but with a defeated silence. He took only a worn suitcase and the terrible realization that the 2 decades he spent waiting for his inheritance had been a colossal waste. My sister, Clara, called the moment the final ruling was public. She didn't call to ask for money or to thank me. She called in tears. I feel terrible, Daniel. He's still our brother. Did we do the right thing? We did what Mother couldn't do, Clara, I told her quietly. We protected her legacy from the chaos she was too weak to stop. The money was never the point. The money was just the tool David used to measure his entitlement. We just took the tool away. The weeks that followed were filled with the arduous process of settling the residual estate. I didn't keep the house. It was too large, too full of the ghosts of duty and betrayal. I sold it, putting the majority of the proceeds into a secure, diversified fund. I used a smaller portion to pay off Clara's remaining student loans and establish a small, managed stipend for her future. And David, he tried to contact me multiple times, his tone shifting from threats to desperate, pathetic pleas for just enough for a month's rent. I never answered. I sent him one final legal letter via my attorney. All communication must cease. The estate has cleared all known outstanding debts on his behalf as a final act of familial charity. No further funds will be released. I did not leave him entirely destitute. I established a small anonymous trust fund managed by a third-party lawyer in a different state, sufficient to pay for a tiny furnished apartment and a minimal living stipend, conditional on him maintaining steady, low-wage employment and avoiding all debt. It was enough to keep him from the streets, but nowhere near enough for the life of luxury and irresponsibility he craved. It was the only way I could fulfill my mother's deepest, unstated desire, to ensure her son survived without enabling his destruction. I took away his ability to succeed in theft, but I didn't take away his ability to live honestly. I often think about the contract. My mother broke it not because she chose David, but because she failed to choose me. She succumbed to the sentimental weakness of a parent who wants to save their failing child, even at the expense of their responsible one. She tried to rewrite our lives on a blank check she couldn't afford. My true inheritance wasn't the $4 million. It was the absolute crushing clarity I gained. Responsibility is its own reward, but it is never a guarantee of justice. You have to fight for justice, even when it means tearing apart your own family. I was the good son who saved the family name, the executor who enforced the rule of law, and the brother who, ultimately, delivered the most profound, necessary lesson David would ever receive. The quiet of my new, smaller home is genuine. I still work as a financial analyst, and I still manage Clara's funds. But now I manage my own life, not in fear of chaos, but with the quiet confidence of a man who looked into the abyss of his family's betrayal and walked away with the only thing that truly mattered, his integrity. This story proves that the greatest battles are fought over the smallest pieces of paper. David's downfall wasn't the theft. It was the forgotten 3-year-old parking ticket and the negligence it exposed. I want to ask you, the listener, if you had found the fatal legal flaw, would you have exposed it? Or would you have chosen silence and let your brother ruin himself with the money? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the Story Vault for more true confessions.